Not sure if this is the right place to post this story, but it's way too creepy not to share it. A friend of mine was at my house, browsing the dark web with Tor. Don't ask what he was doing there. When he came across a site that supposedly showcased banned content from the regular web, like gruesome crime scene photos and such. Anyway, he searched around for a while when he came across a story with an audio clip that he thought looked cool. So he started listening, figuring it would be nothing special. Until he heard it. The more he listened, the more upset he became. Suddenly, he stood up, took off the headphones, and threw them on the desk. He looked really shaken. I asked him what was wrong. He said, "That damn audio file." So now, of course, I wanted to hear it myself. But he quickly deleted the sound file and closed Tor. I asked what was so bad about it, and he said it was like hearing a real-life snuff tape. Only this was an entire group of people, including young kids. I said it was fake, and he yelled back, "No, this shit is totally real." He quickly left, but forgot he saved the story. So I sat down and read it. This is the actual text, copied and pasted exactly as is. A real creepypasta. I'm still afraid to listen to the audio myself, if I could ever find it. I did find a short movie based on the tape that shows a police photo of the real tape, and it even plays a tiny piece of the actual audio at the end. It gives the town a fake name and changes some of the other stuff too. But doesn't matter. It still sends shivers down my spine every time I watch it. Supposedly, the actual tape is much more disturbing. The Dark Afternoon Incident. Real or Hoax? Editorial by Associated Press. For immediate release. As a journalist, I've investigated everything from political corruption to celebrity scandals to international cybercrime. But never have I come across something so bizarre and deeply disturbing as a simple audio tape. I received it at work from my late aunt's estate, whose possessions were divided amongst remaining family members after her death. Of everything she had, only one item was personally requested to go to a specific family member: me. It was a small box containing a tape labeled The Dark Afternoon. I could not understand why she wanted me to have the tape and no one else. Underneath it, I saw a note scribbled in her handwriting. My aunt wrote that the tape was an actual emergency recording made from the dispatch unit at the small town police station she once worked at in the early 1970s. The last sentence made the point that she personally knew a few of the callers on the tape. I thought, so what? I soon found out. Curious, I played it. An hour later, I was shaking. Literally. It was, without a doubt, the single most disturbing thing I have ever heard. It's something that gets under your skin in a way I cannot describe. And I've seen plenty of gruesome things during my career. I've covered wars, crimes, you name it. Much is hard to stomach, but this was different. Maybe it's the more intimate way you listen to it, or the loud, in-your-ear, blood-curdling screams. I don't know. It begins with harsh static, which is broken by a call from a citizen of the tiny town, which I will not name here, to report a dark, featureless form was outside their house, standing there, watching, unmoving. The dispatcher tells the caller that it's most likely some kid playing a prank. When a knock sounds on the caller's front door, here, the line goes dead. Creepy, but nothing extraordinary. Then it happens. Call after call pours in. People all over town report the same dark forms have appeared everywhere. When the dispatcher tried to reassure them, it was nothing to be alarmed about. The callers insist there's something ominous going on and request an officer come by as soon as possible. But with only one officer in the town, there wasn't much that could be done. The callers report the figures were no longer standing there, but closing in on them. You hear pounding on doors, windows shattering, sinister laughter, etc. You also hear sheer panic and terror in the callers' voices as this was happening. It's very disturbing. Then gruesome, bizarre things happen to each one. Things I don't wish to recount. Finally, there's static until the tape runs out. All you're left with is a mental picture of what you think might have happened. Your own imagination is always worse than any photo or video. I told myself it must be a hoax, just a spooky ghost tape made to scare unsuspecting listeners. As a journalist, I know there's no way a town in 20th century America besieged by ominous things, resulting in numerous deaths, would not make the news. Then a thought occurred to me. Could it be real? Maybe my aunt wanted me to hear it, to investigate it, and expose everything on the tape in order to prove it did happen. And that's what I did. After checking, it turns out this small town did, in fact, experience an industrial accident that unfortunately took several lives one afternoon during the early 1970s. Friends and family were told by authorities that the bodies of the victims were contaminated and not able to be claimed for burial. And they were right. They could not be claimed, not because of contamination, but because none of the victims were ever found. No town, state, or federal records reveal that any bodies were ever removed from the town. They just vanished. A deeper question now arose. Did the number, gender, and ages of the people killed in the so-called accident correspond in any way to the callers heard on the tape. Every last one. This was no hoax or accident. It was something else, and my aunt knew it. Needless to say, when I presented the recording and my findings to my press editors, they were more than a little skeptical. However, they were even more worried about the legal ramifications that might result from the town and state's present authorities if they ever knew what I uncovered. I knew then and there they would never let me publish it. But that doesn't mean no one could hear it. That's what the dark web is for. Containing some of the most twisted things the human mind can come up with. Red rooms, murder cams. The dark web is a place of anonymity, a place where both users and the sites they visit can remain hidden. So, it was here that I uploaded the audio, in hopes that someone, somewhere, can finally shed light on what really happened on that dark afternoon. Do I really want to know? I barged through my front door and sprinted up the stairs. I made a run for the bedroom door before kicking it open. I know he's in here, goddammit. Where are you hiding him this time? I screamed. My wife, Susan, was shocked to see me back from work and was sitting in bed reading a book. I don't know what you are talking about, honey. I've been here all morning. I could tell from the red glow on my wife's cheeks and the beads of sweat rolling down her forehead, she was doing more than reading a book. I know that scumbag is here. I can still smell his stinking aftershave. I grabbed the blankets and ripped them off the bed. Susan tried her best to cover her naked body. It's 2 p.m. Why are you in bed naked? Susan looked like a rabbit caught in headlights. She stuttered as her brain tried to make up a plausible answer. I began tearing the room apart, when suddenly I heard the sound of labored breathing coming from inside the closet. I felt a rage of red mist descend upon me before whipping open the closet doors. As I drove back to work, I couldn't get the image of Mason Bradley and his fat gut on top of my wife. Intrusive thoughts about my wife's infidelities permeated my mind as I drove my truck. At 37, my life wasn't where I expected it to be. My dreams of running my own company were as broken as the beat-up pickup truck I used to drive to work. My truck rumbled up to the gates of the steel mill. The security guard at the gate barely acknowledged my existence as the truck roared past him. As I turned into the car park, I noticed my boss, Big Ed, waiting for me. As I got out of my truck, Big Ed came scurrying over. For a man who ran a $1 million company, he always looked as if he was out panhandling for his next meal. His pants were 2 sizes too big, and he wore the same t-shirt every day. "What are you doing tomorrow, Jack?" I hated how Big Ed spoke to me. He had a habit of spitting after every sentence, and would sometimes spit directly at me. I was gonna surprise my wife tomorrow and take her somewhere nice. Big Ed hitched his slacks up into his gut. Listen here now, Jack. My car has been giving me some trouble, and I need you to service her. Couldn't you get someone else to do it? I could tell he was getting annoyed with my attitude. If you want your job Monday, you will do what you're told. He had me over a barrel and knew I couldn't afford to lose the only job the town had to offer. I'll be over first thing in the morning. I arrived at Ed's dilapidated mansion. Ed was outside with his car, swooning over her like it was some beautiful young woman. His face lit up as he ran his hands over the bonnet of the truck. Be gentle with her. She's all I got, said Ed. Ed looked slightly smarter than his usual unkempt manner. You got a date, Ed? When the cats are away, the mice will play, said Ed as he gave me a mischievous wink. Ed pulled a red handkerchief from his back pocket and wiped the sweat from his forehead. I see one scratch on her, and I will snap your neck. I was weary from a long day babysitting Ed's car. All I wanted to do was throw my feet up and have a nice cold beer. I stepped in my front door and was suddenly hit by a familiar smell. It smelt like Big Ed's nasty cologne, but I was too tired to take much notice. My body ached as I grabbed a beer from the kitchen before collapsing onto my chair. As I sat there, sipping beer and reevaluating my life's predicaments, I noticed something sticking from the armrest of my couch. I walked over and picked up the red piece of cloth. The same red piece of cloth Big Ed used to wipe the beady sweat from his grubby forehead. I unfolded the cloth, and to my dismay, there was Ed's name embroidered in the hanky. I was heartbroken and furious. I knew what it meant, and all I wanted to do was tear the house down with my bare hands. But I knew better than to let my anger get the best of me. My eyes welled up as I sped down the country road. I turned the radio up, full blast, to drown out my intrusive thoughts. I was too embroiled in a battle with my consciousness to notice the dark figure walking in the middle of the road. By the time I noticed it, it was too late. I slammed on the brakes and covered my eyes before the car came to a halt. To my relief, I couldn't find any signs of someone injured. I convinced myself stress was making me go crazy. As I tried jumping back into my truck, I heard someone approaching from behind. Having trouble, buddy? I felt a cold chill up my spine. Something was telling me to run, but my legs had turned to jelly from fear. A dark figure stepped out from the shadows of the looming trees overhead. I thought I had hit someone with my truck, I nervously explained. I couldn't make out who I was talking to. All I could see was an outline of a tall, dark figure. I hear you're having trouble with your wife. Do I know you? Suddenly, the dark figure came into focus, revealing an old man. He took something from his pocket before handing it to me. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was Big Ed's red handkerchief. How did you... I began stuttering.
What is it you desire?
Asked the old man. Suddenly, a strange feeling swept over me. A feeling of intense euphoria crept up from my toes, flooding my brain. I wish every man who sleeps with my wife would get sick and die a slow, painful death. The words seemed to come out of my mouth as if someone else was speaking. Suddenly, everything began to spin, and before I knew it, I was back in my truck. I reluctantly drove into work after spending a night in a dingy motel. All I wanted to do was punch Big Ed in his fat face. But with my marriage on the rocks, I knew I couldn't afford it. When I arrived, I was surprised to see Mason Bradley wasn't at his station. I didn't give it much thought, until I saw Big Ed coming from the bathroom, looking like death warmed up. "Hey, Ed, you don't look so good." Ed stood there, looking pale as a ghost, trying to keep the contents of his stomach from ejecting from his mouth. "I think it's something I ate," he explained as I took a step back from him. "Has this anything to do with Bradley being out?" I asked. "Yeah, he was too sick to make it in today. Must be a bug doing the rounds." Over the next few days, I watched Big Ed get weaker, until there was no sign of him. I had gotten word that Mason Bradley had died, and from what I was told, Big Ed wasn't far behind. Since Big Ed wasn't in, we knocked off early. As I drove home, I stopped at the local gas station to pick up some beers. Phil, the owner, was at the counter looking like he was about to pass out. "You all right, Phil? You're looking a little pale there, buddy." Phil covered his mouth, trying his best not to puke all over the counter. "I'm not doing well after picking up this bug that's going around." It couldn't be, I thought to myself, as I suddenly remembered the strange encounter I had the other night. The one I was sure was just a strange dream. "You look after yourself, Phil, and get yourself to a doctor. Will you give my love to that beautiful wife of yours, and tell her I'll drop over her magazines once I feel better?" said Phil, before dashing for the bathroom. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Mrs. Stevens standing outside her house looking distraught. "What's wrong, Ann?" I asked. "It's Mike. They took him to the hospital." "Who took him?" Mrs. Stevens was too distraught to get her words out. "Men in hazmat suits." I felt the familiar feeling of despair rise from the pit of my stomach. Who else got sick? Bob. Tony from across the road. The guy who delivers the milk. They're dropping like flies. Days went by, and news of men getting sick and dying all over town continued to trickle in. Suddenly, I was hit with the realization that the man I met a few weeks ago wasn't a figment of my imagination. I wrestled with the guilt of everyone dying and the heartbreak of my wife's infidelity. I didn't want people dying, and if this was my fault, I needed to fix it. I got in my truck and began driving the same road as before, I was overwhelmed with the thoughts of people dying and the guilt and grief it brought with it. As I drove, I suddenly spotted the old man sitting by the roadside. I slammed on the brakes and jumped from my truck. I ran to the old man before dropping to my knees. "Please, I beg you, whatever you've done, you need to take it back." The old man gave me a confused look.
But it was what you desired. Why would you want to take it back?
I was upset, but I didn't want people to die. Please, it's not what I desire. I cried. The old man put his hand on my shoulder.
What is it you truly desire?
All I want is my wife to love me and only me. I begged. Suddenly, I was overcome with that same feeling of euphoria. My world began to spin before I was suddenly back in my truck, and the old man was nowhere to be seen. As I walked in my front door, Susan was standing there waiting for me. She had a look on her face I had never seen before. She ran and threw her arms around me before kissing me passionately. "I love you so much, Jack. Can you please forgive me?" "Of course I forgive you. I always do." My wife's face lit up, and for the first time, I could feel a genuine sense of love from her, a feeling I always desired. "From now on, you're the only man I want and need," she said as she led me upstairs to the bedroom. That night, we made passionate love, as if we were the only two people that existed in the world. After we finished, we spent the rest of the night cuddling and planning for a better future together. The following morning, I woke up with a splitting headache. As the days followed, I was stuck to the toilet, puking my guts up. As I got weaker, the terrifying realization of the first wish hit me like a ton of bricks. I write this as I'm in the final throes of death, as a warning to others. Be careful what you wish for. When I was young, I developed a love for plush. Large, small, velveteen, cotton. No stuffed animals were off limits. I received one on every gift-giving occasion. Before long, I had quite the collection. Though I loved all of my stuffed animals, one in particular stood out above the rest. One grew to be my favorite. My pet cat, Harvey, died when I was 10 years old. I never really paid much attention to him, having always preferred plush to the real thing. Despite this, his death hit me pretty hard. I regretted neglecting to give him the love and attention he deserved, so much that I cried for almost the whole day when he passed. Luckily, Plush came to my rescue. My mom came home from work a little later than usual. She more than likely followed the sound of sniffling to find me in my room. Upon seeing her, I was overjoyed. In her hands was another stuffed animal to add to my vast collection. A cat, no less. She said she picked it up at the corner store near her office. It was sewn together with an unusual fabric, and it had 2 different-sized buttons for eyes, with no mouth or nose. Its odd appearance gave it a healthy dose of character. It was perfect. I named my new friend Harvey, after the cat I had lost. After a short while, I forgot all about the real Harvey and fell in love with the stuffed version. It was always there for me whenever I felt sad, distressed, or simply needed a friend to play with. I would take Harvey to bed with me every night. He was my best friend for a time. Only one thing could drive a wedge between our friendship: adulthood. I lived with my parents until the age of 23. This is when I graduated from college and decided to move into my own place. My apartment complex was a couple of towns over, so I wanted to minimize the amount of trips it would take to transport my things. As such, I sat in my room for an entire day, going through everything I had ever owned. It was no small task, but it would be worth it in the long run. After going through almost all of my belongings and filling up 3 large trash bags, I moved on to my final task: the enormous pile of stuffed animals in the corner of my room. It would take 2 trips to transport these alone. Luckily, I had a better idea in mind. Without hesitation, I began shoving every stuffed animal I could see into bags. The things that used to mean so much to me would soon be heading for the town dump. I didn't care, after all. I was a grown woman. I had just graduated from college, got a decent job, and was moving out on my own. Plush had no place in my life anymore. After filling up a couple of large trash bags, I came across one stuffed animal that stopped me in my tracks. There, at the bottom of the pile, was Harvey. I had forgotten all about him. Good old Harvey, my best friend and protector. He would chase away my nightmares and eliminate my sadness, no matter how I was feeling or what the reason was behind it. A warm smile danced across my face upon remembering all the good times I'd had with him. I supposed that keeping just one stuffed animal wouldn't hurt. I took Harvey for myself and threw out the rest. He would be a keepsake from my old home, a reminder of my childhood. After a long week of paperwork and signatures, I was finally the proud owner of my own place. I moved in quickly and set up most of my things within a day. I enjoyed the process of arranging and rearranging my new home. It was exciting, knowing that I had finally entered what my parents and teachers had always warned me about: the real world. In reality, there was nothing to be scared of. You just had to know how to operate on your own and handle the hardships that sometimes came your way. So far, so good, I thought. I had unpacked everything of mine by nightfall. After all was said and done, I decided to lie down on my new couch and take a nap. I was exhausted. Unfortunately for me, upon closing my eyes, I heard a loud bang come from over in the kitchen. I jumped up abruptly, wondering if someone had broken into my new apartment on my first day settled in. I crept over, slowly, so as not to alert the intruder of my presence. With each step I took, a new knot would make its way into my gut. By the time I reached the point where I would have to turn the corner, a flurry of butterflies called my stomach home, each one fluttering at a nauseating pace. I knew what I had to do to quell the panic. I bolted around the corner, ready to fight off any would-be attacker. I found no such thing. There, on the kitchen floor, was a box. A few feet away from it was Harvey. A wave of relief came over me. I had left him in one of the boxes. It fell over, creating the loud noise. That's all it was. Thank goodness. I picked up Harvey and threw him in the box. I placed it back on the kitchen counter, this time in a spot where it would not fall over and disrupt my slumber. I then made my way to my new bed and fell onto it, falling back asleep almost instantly. While resting, I dreamt. In my dream, I was a small child. I was at a birthday party for one of my friends, at a carnival, in the middle of a clearing in the woods. My dream self couldn't make heads or tails over how I had arrived there, but I enjoyed the festivities anyway. Aside from the location, there was one glaring absurdity in this dream. Harvey was there. Not the plush cat, mind you. The real one. He was alive and well, and refused to leave my side. I went to go get some cotton candy, and he was there. I went to see a magician perform, and he was there. I even took a ride on the Ferris wheel, and Harvey came up with me. It was actually nice to see him alive again. At first. Harvey came over with me to one of the tents to watch me play a game. I had 3 tries to knock over a stack of milk bottles with a pellet gun. My first and second tries were unfruitful. On my 3rd try, however, I managed to successfully hit one of the bottles at the base of the pile, causing them all to tumble over. That is when I heard screaming. I turned around to see what all of the commotion was about. Behind me was every single person at the carnival, huddled around and staring in my direction with troubled expressions. One man even held his hat to his chest in dismay. I followed their line of sight behind me. This is when my dream became a nightmare. I saw Harvey. He was lying in a pool of blood where the bottles had been. My heart raced as tears ran down my cheeks. He's dead, and I killed him. But how? Before the guilt could set in, the man running the tent came over to me with a huge grin on his face. He handed me a plush kitten. It was Harvey, the stuffed version. An inanimate object, of course, but I could feel his button eyes glaring at me in disgust. Dread and confusion overtook me. but I was soon distracted by the sound of movement. Looking back, I saw that everyone in the carnival had surrounded me. They were completely silent, but their eyes spoke. I was offered an unforgiving, collective stare that I will never forget. They inched closer and closer until I finally woke up. The dream was over, but the fear had only begun. Upon waking, I heard more sounds coming from the kitchen. I jumped up out of bed and ran out there as fast as I could, unwilling to indulge in the nervousness of a slow approach again. What I found when I arrived was strange. Cabinets were open, things had fallen to the floor, and the box I had left on the counter was turned upside down. But there was no one there. The door to my apartment was still locked. Unable to explain my kitchen's messy state, I ran back to my bedroom. Just to be safe, I locked myself in. After making sure the door was secure, I walked over to my bed, hoping to lie down and collect my thoughts. That's when my blood ran cold. Resting on the center of the bed was a plush cat. It was Harvey. Was I being punished for neglecting my cat as a child, or for throwing out my collection of stuffed animals? Did Harvey really want my attention this badly? No, of course not. These things can't happen. I walked over to the bed and picked Harvey up. I looked at him with a smile, remembering the good memories we shared together. He had always been there for me, no matter what. Even if he somehow had come to life, there's no way he would cause me any harm. I set Harvey back down on the bed, but noticed a cool sensation on my fingers. He was damp. But from what? I ran over to my bedside table and turned on the lamp. It was blood. Blood stains covered Harvey and the bed sheets below him. But how? As I pondered and questioned my own sanity, my adrenaline tapered off, allowing me to feel a slight sting in my back. The pain grew fiercer with each passing moment. I walked over to my mirror and lifted my shirt. What I saw defied all reason. There were scratch marks. I wanted to save lives. It's why I became a trauma surgeon, so that I could save people and give them a second chance or a hope of recovery. I wanted to save lives. Now, I just want to forget. About a month ago, I got a call about a patient in need of urgent care. Some asshole on a motorcycle had run a red light and hit a pedestrian outside of a bar. The idiot on the donor cycle was dead, but the pedestrian survived. He was circling the drain, but he was still alive. I got there about as fast as I could, and immediately got prepped for surgery. The patient had suffered numerous fractures from the impact, severe internal bleeding, and one hell of a concussion. I was going to need to stop that bleeding and set their broken bones. I'd hate to call something like that routine, since it technically wasn't routine. But I'd dealt with this kind of thing before. The patient in question was sedated and waiting for me when I walked into the operating room. Just looking at them, I knew that I had my work cut out for me. I could barely see their face underneath all of that blood. They looked to be a young man, somewhere in his mid to late 20s, and he had a fairly fit physique. I figured that if we could maybe stop the bleeding, then he might just have a half-decent chance of pulling through. So that was my first priority. Some shrapnel from the crash had penetrated the patient's abdomen, so I started there. I cut gently, only wide enough to remove the shrapnel and try to stop the bleeding. We had hooked up an IV to transfuse fresh blood into him to keep him alive, along with something to help his blood clot. So far, it seemed to be working, and I was able to get most of the shrapnel out before I finally noticed that something else was wrong with him. I first noticed them clinging to some of the pieces of shrapnel. At first, I thought they were just bits of tissue, but bits of tissue didn't move like that. They didn't writhe like that. These were something else. Something alive. Just looking at them, they almost resembled some kind of thin, stringy worm. And once I saw them, I knew I needed to investigate further. Something was living inside of him, and I had to find out what. The patient was somewhat more stable than he'd been when we started, and after making sure that his bleeding was under control, I took a closer look at his shrapnel wounds. I've heard some surgeons use the term cut and paste before. It's not the most common term out there, but I have heard it. A cut and paste, also known as a peek and shriek to some, is when a surgeon gets a patient on the table, opens them up, and finds that there's nothing they can do. There's no saving them from the inevitable. The only thing you can do is stitch them back up and prepare to deliver the bad news to the next of kin. It's a heavy feeling, realizing that you can't help the person you're standing over, the person you're supposed to save. But sometimes there truly is nothing that you can do. Either the injuries are too severe, or their illness has progressed too far. As a surgeon, you learn to live with it. You don't like it, but you do the best you can and make your peace with that. I can deal with the deaths. I can accept when I've done the best I can to save someone and failed. But the things I saw as I explored those wounds, the things I found writhing inside that patient's guts, the things that were living inside of him, I couldn't accept those. Once I disturbed them, they started to come out. I could see them slithering out through his wounds. Large, thin worms, most of them far longer than the ones I'd found on the pieces of shrapnel I'd pulled out of the patient. I'd never seen anything like them before, and judging by the screams of the other doctors in the room with me, they clearly hadn't either. The worms were coming out of him. They pushed through his wounds, and I could hear some of them plopping wetly to the floor as they writhed and squirmed. All the while, the patient's broken body lay motionless on the operating table, only twitching as the worms tore through him, making the tears in his flesh wider as they escaped him. I didn't need to tell the other doctors in the room to leave. They ran the moment they saw his stomach tear open and watched more of those worms come spilling out of him. As they did, all I could do was stand and watch in horror. I backed toward the door, my hands trembling as the worms twisted on the ground. I looked back up at the patient on the table. His vitals indicated that he was still alive. All of this, and somehow he was still alive. I didn't know how he could possibly still be alive. He had lost so much blood, and now, what those worms had done to him, there was no way he could have survived it. He should have been dead. But his vitals didn't lie. I watched the patient's body twitch and froze, looking up at him. Part of me still felt obligated to help him, obligated to save him somehow, although I didn't even know where to begin with saving him, assuming he could even be saved. He twitched, and I saw his eyes opening. For a moment, I thought that somehow the anesthesia was wearing off, and he was waking up. But no. As I soon realized, this was something else entirely. The patient lifted his head slightly, and his eyes fixated on me. I stared back at him, frozen to the spot in terror. And then I heard the crack of his skull breaking. His vitals flatlined, but his head remained slightly lifted. His eyes were still locked onto me. Part of his head seemed to come undone, as if the skull underneath had shattered, and only his skin was holding it together. His eyes rolled back into his skull before he finally collapsed, and a moment later, I saw something crawling up onto his face. Some other bug. This one, ivory white. It wasn't a worm like the others were. This thing was more like a cross between an isopod and a house centipede, with long, spindly legs and a thick shell. I could feel its beady little eyes on me, watching me, and I swear I could see it thinking, sizing me up, deciding if I was right for it. Then, quick as lightning, it raced toward me. My heart skipped a beat, and finally I ran. Bolting through the door behind me, and slamming it shut. I heard the isopod thing thud against the door, and as I backed away, I saw it climbing up toward the window. It seemed to stare at me for a moment, before crawling up toward the ceiling and disappearing. Needless to say, we put the hospital in quarantine. Both I and the other doctors who had been in the room with me spent 3 days in isolation, getting tested over and over again to make sure we didn't have any trace of those parasites, whatever the hell they were, in our bodies. Then, after that, came the interviews. First, the police spoke to us. Then, some kind of specialist spoke to us, asking us to go over the details over and over again. We told them everything we knew, and they said they'd be in touch if they needed us for anything. And that was it. That was 1 month ago. I haven't been in an operating room since. Hell, I haven't even set foot in the hospital since I got out of quarantine. I can't. I'm too afraid of finding those worms in the next patient I try to work on. I'm too afraid of being thrust into that nightmare all over again, not understanding what was happening or why. I'm afraid of that creature I saw crawling out of the patient's skull. The creature that only I saw, and that nobody ever seemed to find. There was evidence of it, of course. The patient's skull had been split right open, and there was almost nothing left inside. Something had clearly been living in there, feeding on his brain matter and puppeteering his body. And whatever it was still out there. I think it's unlikely that I'll ever get any solid answers about what I saw in that operating room. I've tried to do some research online, but I've come up with nothing. As far as I can tell, there aren't any documented encounters like mine. But based on my limited experience with the creatures living in that patient's body, I've come up with a few theories. I suspect that the thing living in the patient's head was connected to those worms somehow, farming them, maybe growing them in the body of its host. Although for what, I couldn't even begin to speculate. Whatever it was, there was an intelligence to it. Something about the way it looked at me after it emerged from his skull. The way it seemed to size me up. It almost seemed to be thinking. I can't help but wonder if it found another host. Another doctor. Or maybe a patient. I can't help but wonder if it's walking around in their skin right now, letting more of those bloody worms gestate in their guts. I can't help but wonder what it intends to do with them. And I can't help but dread what the answer might be. I think today might be the day we get you to open your eyes. I haven't opened my eyes in 10 years. My therapist calls it optophobia, a fear of opening one's eyes. It all started in my teens, when I witnessed my parents getting murdered. My life was no different than a blind person. The only difference is they have no choice in the matter. But I had to adapt to life as if I was blind. I use a blind stick to get around. I can tell the difference between different coins just by how they sound. I've learned to read Braille. But when people find out I'm not blind, they either think I'm crazy or they think I'm a joke. It's hard to describe the constant feeling of being scared. I live in a perpetual state of terror. It's like closing your eyes to the scary parts of a horror movie. But for me, I kept them closed. I've seen many therapists over the years. Some have gotten close to helping me overcome my fear. But there is one major obstacle. I've been attending a support group for the past 5 years. And throughout those years, people would come and go. Normally, to overcome your fear, you need to face what it is you're scared of. The success rate for this is high. But how can I face my fear if I'm too scared to open my eyes long enough to face it? I always found my therapist's voice so soothing, and always wondered if the voice matched his face. I think today you need to explain to me what happened to your parents. I could feel the bile rise up from my stomach, and my hands began to clam up. I've never fully opened up about what happened all those years ago. It was my birthday, and my mom had just finished cutting the cake. I'm not sure where it came from, or how it got in the house. I watched as it crept up behind my parents. It moved slowly but with murderous intent. A bit like how a lion stalks its prey before it. What did this creature look like? He asked. It's like I have a picture of the creature seared into my brain. And I can still see it even with my eyes closed. His eyes were bright red and filled with a murderous hunger. I explained. My hands were shaking, and I could feel beads of sweat roll down my back. Take your time. I promise you are perfectly safe. My therapist said in a soft, caring tone. It was frothing at the mouth, and he had teeth and claws that looked like they could rip you apart. The sound of my therapist's voice had changed to a more concerning tone. Are you sure it wasn't a man and not an animal? He asked. It wasn't a man. It was some kind of beast. People don't move the way creatures move. And when it was done with my parents, it started to move towards me. I was struck with a paralyzing fear, and I couldn't do anything but close my eyes. I wasn't sure how long I was sitting there, but the police eventually came, and I haven't opened my eyes since. I could hear the glide of my therapist's pen as he made notes. I believe your phobia is your brain's response to the trauma of what you witnessed. It's protecting you from having to relive it. Kids process memories differently from adults. And in your case, saw the murderer as some kind of monster. I could feel a warming sense of calm rise up from my feet, flooding my brain. I promise you're in a safe environment, and there is no killer or creature in this room," said my therapist in a reassuring tone. I could feel my heart pound as I slowly began to open my eyes. My therapist had kept the room dark to protect my eyes. The sensation was probably what a blind person would experience when seeing the world for the first time. My eyes stung as they adjusted to what light was in the room. It took a few moments for my eyes to come into focus before I could see my therapist's soft, reassuring eyes. I always felt that the creature that killed my parents was always close and just waiting for me to open my eyes so I could watch as he ripped me apart. The fear was still there, but the room was empty, apart from me and the therapist. "I told you there was nothing to be scared of." I was about to rejoice in my newfound sense of sight when I was stopped dead in my tracks by the sound of growling coming from behind my therapist. A sound I had only heard once before, when my parents were murdered. A feeling of intense dread overwhelmed me as I watched the same creature I was confronted with all those years ago creep up behind my therapist. It had the same red, hungry eyes as before, and pounced before I had a chance to warn him. My therapist screamed in the same agonizing pain my parents made as he was ripped apart. When it was done, it trained its sights on me, and before it could get to me, I shut my eyes again. You see, it's not a fear of opening my eyes. It's the fear of what would happen if I did.
Contestant number 0, would you like me to repeat the question?
There were tallies carved into the flesh of my skin. I stopped counting when they surpassed 1 million. 1 million cuts. 1 million questions. 1 million times I tried to end it all. My clothes were filthy, shredded, and glued to my skin. I wanted to scream, but my mouth wasn't allowed. I wanted to cry, but if I did, I would be punished. How long had it been since I ate, drank, took a bath? Across from me, Layla was trembling behind her podium, lit up in neon light. Her eyes unseeing, lips curved into a silent cry. If I didn't open my mouth in the next 30 seconds, we were screwed. I risked a glance at Jude, who was trying not to fall asleep, half-lidded eyes flickering. It was really hard not to look at the giant cavern in his chest, where his heart had been yanked out. Jude's punishment for not knowing who sang the song "Hit Me Baby One More Time." Unfortunately, Layla also landed on the revival prize.
Contestant number 0.
Straightening up, I smiled widely at the cameras, trying to ignore the iron chains wrapped around my ankles. The answer is Ryan Reynolds.
That's 100 correct answers in a row.
The host turned to the imaginary audience, and I had the sudden overwhelming urge to break the laptop playing fake applause. The large screen above us lit up with personalized prizes. I almost collapsed when I saw death. If I played my cards right, I could finally die. All of us could die.
All right. To win all of these prizes, you must answer the golden question.
She winked.
However, this time, you have the ability to ask a friend.
No. Jude's frenzied eyes found mine. Skip it. Shut up, Jude. Layla hissed. Can't you see what they're offering? It's clearly a trap. He slammed his buzzer, struggling in his own chains. I'm okay. I can answer it this time. I tried to smile at my fellow contestants, but they refused to look me in the eye. Jude glared down at his podium, shaggy, dark hair obscuring his face. Layla pretended to inspect her fingernails, but she was shaking.
Well, all right.
The host giggled.
Why don't we bring back Luke?
A body bag was dragged in. Inside, the remnants of Luke, contestant 6, who was force-fed battery acid for losing $600K. Luke's body was thrown in front of me. The dead boy's eyes flickered open, confused.
Okay, contestant number 0. For $7 million and all the prizes on screen, please answer the golden question. If you need help, I will allow you to pass the question on to contestant number 6.
Jude face planted his buzzer. We're so screwed. The host's smile widened, slipping right off of her face.
Contestant number 0, also Connor. What was the name of the child? The 6 of you brutally murdered. The following is an account given by a Wyoming farmer who shall remain anonymous to a local news agency in 2011. The agency shut down 2 months later.
My wife and I have always lived a kind of secluded life on our farm with our child. We aren't terribly far from any town or accommodations, but we've been proudly self-sufficient for the most part. We thought it'd give us some peace and quiet. This was until a couple of months ago. Our crops and livestock were dying left and right. The cows were dropping like flies. I still remember talking with my wife at the very start of this, thinking it was some stroke of bad luck, and how it'd all blow over soon. But then it kept on going. Cattle kept on dying. Plants kept on withering. She promised me that she would help make things right. We called family friends one after the other. Maybe they had the same experience and had a better clue on what was happening. Weird weather, plague, contaminants, anything. Nothing. We were alone, and there was nothing about this in the news that could clue us in either. Odd. Later that same day, we decided to finally look around our land. Whatever was doing this had to be in there. But it was already becoming difficult to search. Whatever caused this had done so much damage to our farm that it was almost completely unrecognizable to us. The ground was black as tar, and rotting plant matter was sparsely coating the dirt. Dead cows we had yet to clean up laid across the strangely wet soil. In hindsight, leaving the cows be probably saved my life. Something was definitely wrong with them. Even after all the interventions, nobody dared touch them. I don't know why. Doubt I ever will. My wife continued to insist that she would make things right. She was always a determined woman, much more determined than I was. As we searched, it was hard to even recognize what was supposed to be there from what could be a contaminant. It all looked the same. Soon enough, I heard my wife calling to me to come look at something. The dirt around her looked soaked, more damp than usual. Beside her, slowly drifted a tiny stream of something. It looked strange, pale red, with the texture of egg whites. It smelled strongly of undercooked meat, and felt to be radiating a slight warmth. We moved away. We didn't know what this was. I still don't. We immediately called the police, and hoped that after some chemical cleanup, we could get back to normal. Maybe it would take weeks, months, years, but we would surely get back to normal. Surely. The police came around later that day, inspected the scene, had no clue what they were looking at. Then came the scientists and men in hazmat suits. They took samples, told us to quarantine for a couple of days, and left. Something about the way they behaved was unnerving. This wasn't right. They knew it wasn't right either. They knew this needed to be handled more delicately, but for some reason, they had to rush through this. At least that's what I'm assuming. They were forced to do a botched job. It was around that time that my wife started feeling ill. The following day, the scientists came back and took her away. Examinations, hospital visits, research. All I was told was that they couldn't make sense of it. They were flying the poor woman around the country because no lab could find out what this contaminant was. I don't want to imagine what this must have been like for her. I kept asking about her as the situation worsened. I was trying to follow the situation as closely as possible. I talked to the scientists involved. I had to learn what was going on.
All we know is that the contaminant is some sort of strongly toxic animal tissue. It appears to contain both cow and sheep cells. However, The cells are heavily deteriorated, so this assumption may be a mistake. Whatever it is, it seems to have been heavily genetically altered in a way that none of the labs we have cooperated with can replicate even on a theoretical level.
Everyone was scratching their heads at how this had even happened. The more I learned about the contaminant, the more unbelievable it sounded. I reached out to the police departments, but all I could ever get was a cold, "We're investigating the source of the contaminant." The same non-answer from every single call. I wondered if there even was an investigation. If there wasn't, why? Why weren't they investigating this serious contamination? I was left to fend for myself like this. A week later, I got a phone call from a laboratory telling me my wife passed earlier that morning. Her final moments were spent being frantically shipped from facility to facility. I didn't even get to tell her goodbye. They sent her to a morgue nearby to prepare for the funeral. The same day, I got a letter from the morgue. They couldn't keep the body. Wouldn't explain why. I assumed it was some sort of contamination concern. Whatever it was, I knew that something shady was going on. The letter said the dead body would be returned to my residence due to no available facility willing to accommodate it. The body was brought in an hour later with no warning. All I could do for now was hide it somewhere and hope for the best. Maybe it was how long it had been since I had even last seen her. But something about her face looked different. Not in a dead body way different either. I couldn't describe it, but it felt as if her entire skull had changed shape. I left her in the shed and reassessed my options. I was stuck with a corpse in my house, frantically trying to navigate this mess. Whatever was going on just below the surface here, I knew it wasn't right. At this point, I had connections to every damn laboratory in the mainland. I was reaching out left and right in hopes that someone could do something about this. Nothing. People told me with certainty that nobody would take her in. Nobody would even attempt to dispose of the body. Burn it. Something. I was furious. By sunset, I knew what I had to do. I didn't want to, and it wasn't exactly the burial she would have wanted, but it was the best I could offer. I spent a few hours digging a makeshift grave in my backyard. It was never something I thought I would be doing, and I wasn't terribly sure it was exactly legal either. But it was all I could offer. After all this, the least I could do is let her find peace. Just as I was finishing digging, I heard something. First, there was the sound of something heavy banging against a wall. Then, screaming. And then, some strange, grotesque, dry crackling sound. It was coming from the shed. I didn't know what was happening. I froze as I stared into the shed. Its door violently shaking back and forth as whatever was behind the door tried to push it open. The door was ready to pop off its hinges or snap its locks any second. I had to think. I had to keep that door shut somehow. I knew it wasn't going to work, but I didn't know what would happen if the door opened. Before I could reach it, I was pushed back. The whole weight of the metal door landed on me. I was on the ground. I looked up. It was her. What I could only assume was her. She appeared to be 7 feet tall. Her bones stretched out of her skin, as if it was melting off and simultaneously flaking to dust. She stood over me, her vacant eyes staring down. I could hardly breathe. It was as if time had paused, and I was waiting to die. But she kept staring. Why? I was reaching for my shovel, slowly, until she moved again. She turned her head away to look towards the rest of the farm. All the dead crops and animals. It felt as if something was going through her head. It was hard to tell, but I feel as if I know what that was. At least what option would comfort me the most. She ignored me and shambled into the forest, where the stream originally came from. All I could do was watch. It has been months, and I haven't seen her again. I wonder if I ever will. I wonder if the same will happen to me after this. God knows. So I got home at around 11 p.m. Late night at the office turned into an even later night at the bar. About 4 drinks deep at this point, and I'm tired. Just about ready to fall asleep as I stumble through the doorway. I lay down on the couch and reach for my bag of joints, and spark one up as I pull up YouTube on my laptop. I'm in the middle of watching some luxury cruise tour, close to passing out, when I hear the front door open. I sit up and turn my head slightly, just enough to see my roommate coming in. He hangs his jacket in the closet and doesn't say anything as he walks slowly to his room, which is normal enough. I'd been living with him for about 3 months. Long enough for me to pick up on most of his tendencies. The guy really doesn't talk unless spoken to, which was far from a problem for me. He also generally kept things clean on his end, never causing much in the way of problems. I really couldn't complain. So I go back to watching YouTube, and about 5 minutes later, I hear the shower in his room turning on. Once again, nothing strange. At this point, I'm watching bare-knuckle boxing highlights, with my eyes half open, maybe 1 or 2 minutes away from passing out. I remember waking up in darkness, my head hurting, my throat dry as hell. I sat up slowly, waiting for the grogginess to settle into something manageable. Once it did, I grabbed my phone, checked the time. Around 3:30 a.m., from what I remember. I was starving, and so I got up, began walking towards the fridge. And then I noticed it. A soft, but ever-present noise in the background. It took me a few seconds to really recognize what it was. The shower. Suddenly, the events of last night began replaying in my head, drinking at the bar, Ubering home, laptop, couch, my roommate coming home, the shower turning on. I stood there for a while, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he went to bed and forgot to turn it off. I shook my head. There's no way that happened, I thought. Maybe he slipped and fell. Realizing the implications of this, I rushed towards his room, but found his bathroom door locked. I began pounding on it. "Hey man, you all right?" No response. I considered kicking the door down, but decided to call 911 before I did that. I took my phone out, preparing to dial, when I noticed that I had an unread text. One from my roommate. "Hey man, I couldn't sleep, so I went over to my girlfriend's place. Not sure when I'll be back. Sent 2 hours ago." I look at the bathroom door, then back down at my phone. Everything about this was wrong. First of all, my roommate barely texts me, and certainly never to tell me that he's going out. Second of all, I know for a fact that he's single and has been for a while. And third of all, who the hell was in the shower then? I tried calling him. No answer. Sent him some texts, but no response. I walked over to his desk and saw that his keys and wallet were still beside his laptop. My head's starting to spin at this point, and I get out of there, go back into the living room, and turn on the lights. I'm pacing around in a circle, trying to follow the plot, while also trying to ignore the shower, a noise that I never could have imagined being so dreadful in any context. Sometime later, I hear something vibrating on the kitchen counter. I move towards it and see that it's a phone. My roommate's phone. The panic begins setting in, and I immediately grab my keys and run out of the apartment. I make my way down the hall and take the stairs down to the lobby. But even that doesn't seem far enough away. And so I make my way over to the McDonald's across the street. I sit there for a while, considering calling the cops, but for some reason, feeling too nervous to do so. But even though there's hardly anybody in there, the place begins to feel suffocating, and I decide to leave, walking back out onto the empty streets. Almost immediately, I get this feeling that I'm being watched, and I feel my gaze drifting up and towards the apartment. Soon, I'm looking at my balcony, and I see somebody standing there. A dark figure stood completely straight, stiff to the point where it nearly resembled a mannequin. But it isn't one. If I look closely, I can see it just slightly swaying. I froze in place, my mind hardly able to understand or accept what it was seeing. It's not my roommate. It's too tall. In fact, it's too tall to be anybody I know. Its head nearly scraping the bottom of the balcony above. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out any of its details. The darkness and distance may have been enough to explain that away, but there was something about it that drove me towards a different conclusion. That this thing simply possessed no detail that could have been observed. That the only element of its composition was that of unadulterated darkness. Of course, my gut instinct was to get the hell away from it. But the voice in my head was telling me that if I were to try and run, this thing would end up following me. I went back into McDonald's instead, locking myself in the bathroom as I finally dialed 911. I told the operator that someone had broken into my place, but that I had gotten out of there without them noticing, and that they were still in there. It was the story that most accurately represented the situation, without making me come across as batshit insane. The operator told me that they'd be sending somebody over, for me to hang tight. I left the bathroom, waiting at the table closest to the exit, until I could see the red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. I went outside to meet the cops, looking up at the balcony to find it empty, though the door to the living room had been left open. They pelted me with a bunch of questions that I found difficult to answer. Is the intruder armed? Do I have any idea who it might be? What are their intentions? I told them I didn't know, that I couldn't figure it out, but they just kept on asking. Soon, I was practically yelling at them to go up there and check it out for themselves. And I suppose the terror in my voice was enough for them to begin taking this seriously. They told me to wait by the entrance, and I watched on as they entered the building. I was out there for a long time, growing increasingly anxious at the thought of what they were going to tell me when they came down. A few minutes later, the silence was broken by a single, muffled gunshot. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I continued to wait there, unsure of what to do otherwise. 20 more minutes of silence, and the officers still hadn't come down. Soon, I could hear more of them approaching in the distance. Before I knew it, 4 more cop cars had pulled up around me, and the scene had fallen into chaos. Officers shouting over each other and into their radios. More questions being hurled my way, none of which I was able to answer. The next few sequences were mostly a blur, but I remember the building being evacuated. The tenants, frightened and confused, as they were ushered outside, while the officers became more and more frantic. I remembered hearing more scattered gunshots. Some screaming. Other noises that were difficult to make sense of. There were a few lapses in my memory after that, but I recall being pushed into the back of a police car. After being driven to the station, I was led into one of the interrogation rooms, where I found 2 nondescript men in suits waiting for me. They didn't introduce themselves, and immediately went into a series of questions, each one more bizarre than the last.
What company was your roommate employed by? What was the nature of his job? How many different people have been inside your apartment since your roommate moved in? Have you ever heard voices inside your apartment from the hours of midnight to 3 a.m.? Voices that did not belong to your roommate. Have you ever seen a circle of people
standing outside of the apartment from the hours of midnight to 3 a.m. People that were exceptionally tall. And one of the most unsettling ones. Have you ever seen somebody standing at the foot of your bed upon waking up between the hours of midnight to 3 a.m., only for them to disappear moments later? If so, do you remember what they looked like? Any distinct features? As they continued probing me, my mind began conjuring up some of the strange shit that had happened after my roommate had moved in. Shit that I had written off as figments of my imagination, simply because I had no other explanation for them. I did hear the voices, always coming from the room next to mine where my roommate slept. I was always so tired when I heard them, but I do remember it sounding like a young woman or a man with an extremely deep voice. I could never make out any of the words. It always sounded like gibberish. And then, there was that one time I went to the bathroom in the middle of the night, still half asleep. I didn't bother turning on the lights as I entered. But as my eyes began adjusting to the dark, I could have sworn that somebody was already sitting on the toilet. Somebody extremely tall. Of course, when I turned on the lights, nothing was there. It was easy to chalk it up as a product of late-night drowsiness at the time, and I had never really thought about it since. After doing my best to give them useful information, the suits spent a good few minutes taking notes on their phones. Once we were done, they sat up quickly, told me that they'd be in touch before leaving the room. A cop came in a few minutes later and told me that since I couldn't return to my apartment, they would set me up in a nearby hotel until they were able to get the situation under control, and that I should stay put until they give me a call. What happened? What did you guys find up there? He stared at me for a long time, not as if he were deep in thought, but as if he held deep aversion for what he was considering telling me. Eventually, he just shook his head. "I don't know," he said. I really don't know." I nodded, tried to smile, though I'm sure it didn't come across very well. It's the next day now, and I'm in the hotel. Of course, I couldn't sleep, couldn't really eat. The officer hasn't called me yet. When I tried searching up information about the evacuation on the internet, all I can find are articles claiming that it was due to a fire. A fucking fire.
Update.
I fell asleep, and I just woke up. It's 1 a.m. now, and I can hear the shower. I have been living in rural Ohio for about the last year. Since moving in with my husband, I've become what some would call the crazy cat lady of our neighborhood. It's not that I have a lot of cats. It's that I feed and befriend every stray I come across. Living in the country means you are surrounded by wildlife. Deer, mice, skunks, rats, bats, raccoons, possums, and, you guessed it, cats. Humans are terrible creatures sometimes. They have a habit of taking in animals they can't handle. then quickly changing their minds when things get too hard. When that happens in the city, most people drop their new pets off at a local shelter. Here in the country, they just throw them outside. If those unloved furballs aren't fixed, they team up and make more of themselves. If I had to guess, our small town alone has about 50 strays. I would guess I've made friends with around 15 of them in the past year. I leave food on my front and back porch for them every night. I brush the more friendly ones. And I've even kidnapped a few for a day to take them in for vaccines. I can't adopt them all, but I want to try and make life a little less hard for all these guys. Lately, something strange has been happening though. I have a tendency to stay up late. My husband started working the night shift about a year ago, and it's hard to get used to sleeping in an empty bed. Since we moved for his job, I have developed a case of separation insomnia. I only really sleep well on his days off. I work the average 7 to 3 shift. When I get home, I try to clean the house, tend to our pets, indoor and outdoor, and make dinner/breakfast for him to eat before work. During this time, my husband, Jake, is fast asleep. He sleeps just fine without me. Lucky bastard. Sometimes, I nap with him after I make dinner, and he wakes up around 9 p.m. to get ready for work. Once he's gone, I tend to just turn on the TV and game to pass the time until I have to get myself ready for work. Jake and I pass like ships in the night. It's hard to manage sometimes. But we're working towards buying the house we're currently renting. After this past week, though, I hope he can be convinced to relocate. About 6 days ago, I was in the living room watching a show about hoarding when I heard something big dragging across our porch. It was around 11 p.m., and Jake had literally only been at work for an hour at this point. Sounds on our porch weren't unusual. There was a cat buffet out there. But whatever had made this sounded bigger than a cat. Its weight was closer to that of a dog, or even a person. I paused the television and waited in silence for it to happen again. My dog, Bella, asleep soundly at my feet. Nothing happened. Our front door leads straight into our living room. There are 2 huge windows that never seem to be completely covered by the curtains, and our couch sits right below those windows. I tried to arrange the curtains so the part of the window that isn't covered is farthest away from my face. If I'm laying on the couch, it's nearest to my feet. I peeked out one of the windows onto the porch and saw absolutely nothing there. So I simply pressed play and kept watching my shows. When the sun came up, nothing was unusual, except the cat food was completely untouched. The bowl on the back porch wasn't empty like I expected. Nothing happened for a few days. Honestly, I had kind of forgotten about the sounds until 2 nights ago. This time, the dragging happened around 2 a.m. I was actually upstairs in our bedroom when I heard it this time. Our bedroom window is right above the porch, and I was shocked to realize I could hear this sound from all the way upstairs. It was far too heavy to be a cat. I muted the TV and listened, slightly nervous. My dog was in the bed next to me listening as well. The dragging continued. It was like someone was dragging their shoes across the wooden porch. Bella started to growl. It was a low, throaty sound I had never heard her make before. The fact that my dog was upset by this made me nervous. I couldn't call Jake until he went on break at 3 a.m. Not knowing what else to really do, I got up from the bed and walked quietly to the window. I opened it about a finger's width and listened for the dragging. The sound of a cat almost had me laughing with relief. Of course it wasn't a person. Bella had never once growled at a cat on our porch before, but maybe it was because we were all the way upstairs. I wondered if the sound was Toby. He was an orange tabby that was heavier than all the rest of the strays. He had a few other houses on the street feeding him. The dragging continued. Even Toby didn't seem to be that heavy. For almost 15 minutes, something dragged across my porch from one end to the other, repetitively. Then, it stopped completely. Bella stopped growling and went back to sleep, and I waited nervously to call Jake. He thought it was Toby.
You're tired.
He told me.
You're up at night watching TV by yourself. Your imagination is running away from you.
That didn't explain why Bella was upset. But maybe he was right. For all I knew, there was a stray cat I didn't know yet, putzing around on our porch. The next morning, the cat food bowl was toppled over. None of the food inside was eaten. This all leads me to what happened last night, just a few hours ago. Jake was off work Monday. We spent the night enjoying each other's company and watching movies on the couch. Neither of us heard anything strange. I went to work Tuesday morning on basically no sleep at all. I came home to do my usual routine and threw Jake's work uniform into the laundry. While I waited for it to dry, I made the mistake of falling asleep on the couch. I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of a cat meowing. Moonlight was streaming through the crack where the curtains didn't fully cover the window by my feet. The television had turned itself off because it was on a set timer. Jake must have gotten ready and left for work without waking me up. Bella lay on the floor beside the couch, and again, she was growling. Bella growled louder at the sound of it. Her hackles were raised, and I could tell she was working her way up to a bark. Dragging again. The thing lumbered across the porch and over to the window. I could see the shape of it blocking out the light where the curtain didn't cover. In that moment, I was sure of two things. The first was that there was not a cat on my porch at all. The second was that whatever was out there was looking into my living room. This was a damn near perfect cat impression. If I couldn't see the huge, horrifying, human-shaped shadow at my window, I might have even believed it. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I couldn't move. Bella jumped to her feet, ran to the side of the window where the shadow loomed, and let out one good, ferocious bark. Then, she seemed to really see whoever was at the window. She began to tremble and whimper. The shadow said to her. I was too frightened to move. My dog was whining at my feet, and I couldn't tell if this weirdo on my porch was able to see me laying there or not. After a few moments of silence, a bark resounded through the room. At first, I thought Bella had found her voice again, but she was still shaking at my feet. No sound had come from her mouth. The shadow at the window was mimicking her. I could feel tears start to stream down my face. All I could think about was a question. Had Jake locked the door before he left for work? I don't know how long I laid there, crying in silence and fear, listening to this shadowy person meow and bark. When the sun came up around 5 a.m., the shadow shifted. It seemed to slowly drag itself away from the window and off my porch. It's now 6 a.m. as I write this. Bella and I are still shaking. Jake should be getting off work soon. When he gets here, I'm telling him, I want to fucking move.
Today's story is by BlackVolumes. Links in the description below.
I fully lost my sight 20 years ago. So, imagine my initial euphoria after 2 decades of living in a blackened world upon seeing something on last night's walk home. A miracle, you might think. Though this may beggar belief, I hope I never see anything again. My guide dog, Ted, tugged the lead to say we should continue walking home, but I was transfixed by a red pinprick in the distance. Now, without offering too graphic a description of my childhood injury, my eyes are non-existent. This isn't a case of partial blindness. I don't see lights, shadows, or shapes. I have spent 20 years in absolute darkness without hope of ever seeing anything again. And yet, inexplicably, a red shape loomed on the horizon. How? Equally excited and shocked, I diverted from my daily path and headed towards the first thing I had seen since the age of 10. Ted whined grumpily, confused by our sudden detour. But he begrudgingly led me along winding streets, far from the ceaseless chatter and loud vehicles of the city. It took about 15 minutes of walking into the depths of what I assume must have been a sleepy neighborhood, for the red speck on the horizon to grow into a distinguishable shape. It was a house. A red-bricked new build, sitting in the midst of the endlessly black void that had been my entire world for so many years. And after another 15 minutes of walking along seemingly endless roads, we were finally standing before the mysterious building. Ted growled, and I felt the lead move in the opposite direction as he tried to guide us back the way we came. "I can see it, boy," I whispered tearfully. "Tell me you can see it too. I'm not crazy, am I?" Ted started barking and yanking more assertively on the lead, but I gripped tightly and pulled him towards the house, before stumbling painfully into something metallic. I fumbled with my free hand, fairly certain that I'd found the house's front gate. Contending with a distressed and noisy dog at my side, I eventually found and lifted the latch, shoving the gate open. The house was entirely unremarkable in and of itself. I'd expected a glitzy, futuristic building, given it had been so long since I'd seen the world. But it looked no different from every other British home I remembered from my childhood. Red bricks, brown roof tiles, and white-framed windows. The number 11 was plastered in gold on a black, featureless front door. Ted must have planted his paws firmly on the ground, because I had to practically drag him along the path leading up to the front door. "I know you're scared. I don't understand it either, Ted. But I might never see anything ever again. I have to know what's happening. I have to find out how and why I can see this place. Please, just let me see whether anyone answers. I promise we'll go home afterwards." Trembling, with a feeling that had morphed from excitement into sheer anxiety, I weakly knocked on the black front door before me. A wave of pins and needles passed through my hand as I realized something. The door was real. I felt it. I'd convinced myself that the house must be a fragment of my imagination, but there was no denying that my knuckles had rapped against the familiar feel of a soft wood surface. My heart pounded erratically as the reality of my situation dawned on me. This wasn't a fantasy anymore. I was standing before something I could see. I looked around to find that the rest of the world remained a dark and empty chasm. I couldn't even see Ted at my feet, though I could certainly hear his agitated sounds. So why could I see the house? And then there was a sudden, sharp noise. Metal, barreling rapidly against wood. It had to be the door lock. "Hello?" I called excitably. I was wondering whether I might be able to speak to the owner of the house. Footsteps pattered softly away, I think. I can't say. And usually, I'd be able to hear a pin drop in another room. In the absence of sight, many blind people will tell you that their other senses become heightened. And yet, it was as if the sudden introduction of color and shapes to my world had lessened my usually sharp hearing. But there was much more to this unexplained event than that. Sight. What sight? I don't have eyes. "Hello?" I called again. "Please. I just want to talk." A door opened, but it wasn't the front one. It sounded like a side door, leading out onto the walkway. I know it was foolish, but you don't know how it feels to spend years in darkness and finally be offered a glimmer of light. I couldn't resist, as much as Ted did. stumbling across the front lawn, tripping over a bramble-ridden bush. I made my way around to the side of the property. Sure enough, an open side door blew lazily in the early evening breeze. Ted's barks were growing hoarse, and he had instead resorted to a fearful whimper. I'm not sure why I wasn't afraid at that moment, but I would be. As I stepped through the doorway, I entered a glistening kitchen. White, pristine, sterile. "Hello?" I called for a third time. "I really need to talk to you. Do you know what's happening to me? What is this place?" Through the open kitchen doorway, the main lobby was illuminated by an overhead light. Ted stood invisibly beside me, but I could see every part of the house itself, every furnishing and light fixture, and that included the reflection in the tall mirror hanging in the entryway. The artificial light cast onto the glass pane was part of the house, after all. And so, for the first time in 20 years, I saw myself and the uncertain little retriever beside me. The last time I'd seen my face, I was a child, but before me stood a bearded man with a weary face and 2 glass eyes. I couldn't quite make the connection that I was looking at myself. Stroking my beard thoughtfully, I took slow strides towards the mirror. How could it be that a man with no eyes was able to see himself? The terror started to work its way into my brain. Gone was the sheer joy I'd felt upon seeing things again. The impossibility of my situation was ringing alarm bells, as it already had for Ted. And then I caught the reflection of a small shape flitting behind me. It had the shape of a young boy, but I didn't need to get a proper look to know that there was something distinctly unnatural about him. I screamed, spinning around. The floorboards creaked beneath the weight of something slipping up the stairs, giggling as it went. An invisible thing. I'd only been able to see it in the mirror. It isn't part of the house, I realized. Ted started barking, pulling on his lead to chase whatever had disappeared up the stairs. "Who's there?" I croaked frightfully. No response, other than fading giggles and footsteps across the upstairs landing. But I finally accepted that there were no answers to be found in that place. None that would make any sense anyway. And so I turned to face the kitchen again, pulling Ted's lead. "Come on. You've got your wish, boy. Let's get out of here." As I started to walk towards the open side door in the kitchen, strangely relieved to see the black outer world that awaited me, I was baffled to find that Ted was standing still, and he wouldn't budge. I turned to look in the mirror in the lobby, and I could see the reflection of my dog standing in a frozen position before the stairs. "Are you kidding me? You were right, Ted. This place is wrong. Let's go." Reaching from somewhere beyond the reflection of the mirror, 2 hands, withered but clearly those of a child, swiftly swooped towards my dog. And by the time I'd blinked, Ted had been unclipped from his lead. He vanished up the stairs with a loud whimper. I screeched, running back into the lobby. I hauled up the stairs 2 at a time, forgetting something crucial. I could see the house, but I could not see its inhabitant. And when I reached the upstairs landing, I found myself plummeting onto the quintessentially British carpet beneath me. Something had tripped me.
An eye for an eye. A truth for a truth.
A boy's strangely ancient voice softly whispered. I felt a cold hand wrap itself around one of my ankles, and I screamed piercingly as I thrust my foot at the invisible intruder behind me. Ted was barking from a nearby room with a closed door.
Didn't get me. Blind as a bat, Mikey.
He giggled again. Who are you? I sobbed, crawling across the carpet from a threat I could not see. How do you know me? I could see imprints in the carpet as the invisible boy crept towards me on hands and knees.
Eyes and lies, lies and eyes.
He wheezed, seizing both of my ankles. I shrieked in terror as an unseen monster with abnormal strength dragged me across the landing towards the room at the far end. As the door opened, I heard Ted barking maniacally.
Want its eyes?
The boy giggled. Leave him alone! I cried. I found myself lying on the floor of a room unlike the rest of the pristine house. It was derelict. There was a mattress in one corner of the room, a sink with a mirror on the wall, and a small radiator that was rattling. That was where Ted had been tied. Just let us go, I pleaded.
Not until I thank you,
the boy whispered, pacing across the rickety floorboards. For what? I moaned. Above the dingy sink, a face suddenly appeared in the cloudy, unclean mirror. The boy was barely distinguishable, but I saw enough. Bulging too far out of their sockets were bloody eyes that seemed badly fixed in place. Eyes that I somehow recognized. Mine. But I didn't want to believe it.
Time to remember.
The boy giggled.
My eyes now.
I had suppressed most of what happened to me 20 years earlier. But in that moment, the boy's vicious voice rang some distant bell in my traumatized brain. A boy jumping me in the street. A vicious beating. A sharp instrument plunging into my sockets. And those words. My eyes now. But that was 2003. It couldn't be the same boy. An ageless child with a blood-stained face, withered hands, and bulbous eyes, grinning at me in the reflection of the mirror. He couldn't be human.
I feel bad, Mikey. Let me help you see.
The malevolent thing smiled, walking away from the mirror and vanishing from my reflected field of view once again. I heard tussling at the radiator as the boy untied my dog, and Ted growled aggressively. Get off him, you monster! I cried, jumping to my feet and lunging blindly forwards. Fingernails slashed into my cheek from my unseen attacker, and I fell back to the floor, I couldn't see the boy or my dog, not without the aid of a mirror, but I must have distracted the horrid thing long enough to give Ted the upper hand. A loud growl sounded, followed by an inhuman screech. Paws pounded against the floor, and I felt the warm, familiar stench of Ted's breath on my face. "Let's go!" I yelled. I jumped to my feet a second time and headed onto the landing, Ted brushing against my side. We scurried downstairs, not daring to look behind us. Not that it would have benefited me. With my dog leading the way, we stumbled through the kitchen's side door and returned to the safety of the darkness. Back to the real world. Far from that horror house. But it's still out there. I'm planning on moving away as soon as possible, because I can still see that horrible red speck on the horizon, all the way from my bedroom window. The only visible thing in my darkened world. And I wish I hadn't seen what lives inside.